Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
Since the dawn of the GAA in 1884, the telling of its stories have been just as important as the sports. Through the years, heroes and matches have been immortalised, inspiring generation after generation. But some of its most important stories have also gotten lost or turned into legend. And in this series, we will explore some of the GAA's most fascinating forgotten tales, separating rumour from reality and myth from the truth that is often more amazing than the fiction. I'm Michael Foley.
And I'm Ciaran O'Hara.
So join us for Over the Bar, exploring the histories of the GAA.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Over the Bar, the Gaelic Games History Podcast. Hopefully now you're all over your gorging of chocolate, the associated confectionaries. Now we get bunnies too, as well as eggs, Michael.
Oh, that's great, isn't it? Listen, I'm not going to criticise any chocolate form of anything. You listen, you can make whatever you want. I mean, to be honest with you, I'll eat commemorative Easter 1916 rifles made of chocolate if you send them my way. No problem there. Nothing. Anything. Just no holds barred.
And for all of you who've been, avidly waiting for some Over the Bar merch, we've got some chocolate schlitters and footballs for you.
yeah.
I'm just throwing that in there because we were so close to April 1st for Easter this year.
I know, yeah. Imagine you just arrive and you open an envelope of melted slitter. No one wants that.
But being as we are around Easter, we thought, and it being the podcast's first Easter, that we would pose the question of, can you tell me, Michael, how many GAA people were involved in the 1916 Rising?
I can definitely tell you that. And of course, that leads to the broader question, if you like, of how involved were the GAA in the Rising? Because, I suppose, when I was a much younger man, you would have kind of got the impression that the GAA were all over the Rising. That it was as part and parcel of being a GAA member at the time, that if an opportunity to rebel occurred, that you would be in the vanguard. The organisational structure was there. Everything was there. You had even if you think about the names of the clubs that we have now, stadia, how many Pierce stadiums do we have? Padraig Pearse's clubs, Michael Glavy's, O'Hanrahan's clubs. So many other ones, so many other ones.
But the naming of clubs after patriots is a thing, and it's a thing that's pre-existed this. We have Wolftone's clubs at this time and Emmett's clubs at this time. It's a feature of the early GAA. Now, I thought you were going to say that the evidence would be in the number of GAA members who drew a pension on the back of 1916. But
the numbers for that I do not have. But if we say that there was, again, the numbers are a little bit sketchy, a little bit like, I think it's probably a little bit like, the crowd at Munster and the All Blacks in 1978. How many were in the GPO? It probably expanded as the years went on. And how many people were in the Rising? So to kind of say between 15 and 1800 people rose on Easter Monday 1916 and fought. So between 15 and 1800. And of that number, the estimate is about 302 were GAA members.
That's a very precise estimate.
It is, and I have seen another estimate of 305. So there's three dodgy ones somewhere in that. But around that number.
There's
And it
three
is
fellas
because
that may have gone off to play rugby and soccer afterwards and being expelled.
just expunged from the record. But like, to be fair, I mean, that in itself, that we can have that accurate a number, is a tribute to the work really that's been done by historians, particularly in the last 40, 50 years, and maybe even shorter space of time, 10 or 15 years, in terms of trying to put the GAA's role in the Rising in a better context. Because like in 1916 itself, the immediate reaction to the GAA was to try and create distance between themselves and the Rising. Then you move on maybe 6 years to when, the Irish Free State comes into being, and suddenly it's much more advantageous to be seen to be one of the carriers of the revolutionary banner over the previous decade, and to be one of those organisations that were at the heart and soul of the struggle. And the GAA are not behind the door in putting themselves now at the heart of the Rising. And that had even begun, in the 2 or 3 years post-Rising, but certainly it comes strong in the early years of the Free State. And by the time you get to the 50th anniversary of the Rising, like Croke Park is absolutely central to that, to those commemorations and everything that goes on around them, which we'll talk about later. So I suppose what we're doing here today is just trying to tell the story as it was. What was the GAA's actual involvement in the Rising? How central were they to its organisation? How central were they to providing their members as volunteers who went forward and rose up at the time? And afterwards, the impact and how it sort of fomented through the organisation, and politically how it moved it either which way.
Okay, so where do we begin with this? Do we begin with the foundation of the volunteers? Because that's effectively the point where it becomes military or paramilitary, or however you'd like to describe it, depending on the vantage point of history. So is that where it begins, or has it been something that's developed with the foundation of Sinn Féin?
Well, it's probably the volunteers is the best place to start, all right. But it is worth just pointing out that, so the volunteers are formed in late 1913. And the decade, you could say, before the Rising, so go back to 1906 up to 1916. To quote Paul Rouse, actually from a very, very good book called The GAA and Revolution in Ireland, 1913 to 23. Paul wrote in that as part of, I think it's a series of essays, but in his piece he wrote, the story of the GAA in the years immediately before the 1916 Rising is ultimately the story of the triumph of play. And that is to say that the GAA's primary concern and its biggest success was in actually taking the organisation from a position of near extinction at the turn of the 20th century to a much more stable place by the time you got to, say, 1915, 1916, keeping in mind that we had a global war on as well. And we were obviously active participants in that as members of the British Empire. So that was the great success. That was where their focus was, really. I mean, Douglas Hyde, the future president, and obviously a huge figure in the cultural and literary revival of the 1880s that the GAA's formation was kind of swept up in as a kind of a bulwark, I suppose, against the increasing anglicisation of Irish culture. And the GAA's position in that has been well explained. But Hyde, when he was a big fan of the GAA, but he noticed the same thing, that GAA members, the average GAA person, player, official supporter, whatever, they didn't really see themselves in that sort of wrap the green flag around me, I've got a pike in the thatch ready to go, whenever we get the nod. That wasn't their outlook. I mean, Hyde wrote in 1908, very often he said the players never think of any other aspect of the association than that of the match alone. The idea that they are really and powerfully contributing to the revival of Irish nationality has, I believe, never occurred to them. So in the same ways, and I've always argued this, particularly around Bloody Sunday 1920, the GAA is a broad church. It's pulling people in from every sector of society, whether it is your income, your politics, what part of the country you live in, the whole lot. It's a rainbow. It's a cross-section of the country, very same as it is now. And by and large, in the same way as it does now, that cross-section, the majority, will lean towards the centre ground, the moderate ground. And so they're not overly politicised. Okay, you're more likely to be of a nationalist leaning. If somebody puts you up against the wall and says, do you want a free Ireland? Do you want independence? You're probably more likely as a GAA member to go, yeah, okay. But very quickly followed by, it's not, don't want to make any hassle over it or anything. I don't want to
I'm kind of happy with home rule.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get it without, having to blow anybody up would be good. Really, really strong on, really keen on that. So it's much the same as your average GAA member as the decades continued on. So that's where the GAA was when the Volunteers were formed in, as you say, in late 1913. Now, as we know, the GAA was also always a political space in terms of the Irish Republican Brotherhood trying to take it over in the late 1880s and succeeding to get their people into positions of power and to be used as a forming ground for some kind of revolution. There was always a tension between those who wanted to push the idea of the GAA as a non-political, non-sectarian, sports-focused organisation and those who saw it as something else. That was always there. And that is coming to a head by November 1913. So the Irish Volunteers are in the process of being formed, and the GAA are asked, would you like to come and speak at the opening meeting, which was going to be in the Rotunda in Dublin in November 1913. And true enough, Luke O'Toole, the General Secretary, accepts the invitation and speaks to the gathering. Now, O'Toole, at this point and all the way through, he will still be General Secretary in Bloody Sunday and out the other side, 1920. He sticks to the idea that the GAA as an organisation is non-political, non-sectarian. But does that apply to individual members, including himself?
Well, that's where I was going to come in there, because for our Corja Club members this week, we have the story of what happens post-rising and the Frongach internment camp. And one of those that is interned is the president of the GAA, James Nolan, who is avowedly nationalist. He's involved in the Gaelic League, he's involved in the GAA, and he is involved in Sinn Féin as an organiser. So, as you say, you can have the middle of the road position reflected by the Secretary General, but you can have the elected president of the association who is far more staunch in his nationalism.
And as a matter of fact, Luke O'Toole was a Sinn Féiner. He would have had Michael Collins, Tom Clark, all these Irish revolutionaries of the period to his house. His house was used as a safe house during the War of Independence. So his personal politics were very clear. The personal politics, as you mentioned there, of a lot of the hierarchy of the GAA in this period was very clear. But as an organisation, conscious of having to hold a vast church of members together, they didn't promote that view as a consensus policy. We are not, the sporting wing of the Volunteers. If you, as a GAA member, want to go out and join the Volunteers, we're not going to bar you from playing our sport because we're a sporting organisation. But for example, O'Toole goes and speaks at that meeting, but the first formal request, right, from the Volunteers to the GAA is to use Croke Park for drilling purposes, and they're told no, you cannot. The informal agreement is, as I say, this is our policy, as an organisation, but we will not, obstruct individual GAA members who want to start a unit of the Volunteers in their local village or in their local suburb or whatever the case may be, in their parish. But as a body politic, there you go. Like, it's impossible. It's really actually impossible to separate the politics from the sport here anyway. But as a sporting organisation, they're not going to go there. Like in 1914, the GAA Congress, a member of the Volunteer Executive addressed the GAA Congress like that year. But at the same time, there was a huge volunteer rally that same day that Congress was held in 1914. And the GAA were very conscious of getting Congress out the way by lunchtime so that people could go to this huge rally. There was 25,000 volunteers paraded through Dublin. And, there was Frank Dineen, who had obviously secured Croke Park as a ground some years before and was still a very prominent GAA member. He was like on the saluting platform that day as the volunteers went past. If you go through the names, I mean, it's amazing. I mean,
well, I might just stop you there, because I would imagine there wouldn't have been a proliferation of arms at the time. So I would imagine a lot of them are drilling with Hurleys.
Oh, there's that, of course, as well. And that continues on, post 16. Like when you go down the country and see the volunteers in 17, 18, 19, a lot of them are drilling with Hurleys then as well. So yeah, absolutely, that is the case. Like if the likes of Austin Stack, who was the Kerry GAA chairman, he helped organise the first meeting of the volunteers there. Like Pat Airplane O'Shea, one of the great Kerry midfielders of the early 20th century, he organised a company in Castle Gregory. Dick Fitzgerald, the great Dick Fitzgerald, of whom, if we're doing an episode on Frongach, he's going to be central to the Frongach story. He was a company captain in Killarney. JJ Walsh, very prominent in Cork GAA, wrote about the GAA as, quote, a training ground for physical force. He arranged the first volunteer meeting in Cork. The likes of a Tipperary player, Frank McGrath, organised a unit of the volunteers in Tipperary. Sean Matthews and Willie Walsh, after whom Walsh Park in Waterford is named, they were the highest ranking members of the volunteers in Waterford. You mentioned James Nolan, the GAA president. In 1914, after the volunteers had been formed, Nolan did encourage members to join, and he said, join the volunteers and learn to shoot straight. So it's very, very.
He wasn't talking about Kilkenny forwards there.
No need for that. That's the kind of thing that really gets you in trouble. But the blurring of the lines is immense. And I mean, GAA activity is affected by volunteer activity in practice. Like, for example, obviously, the Irish volunteers and the Ulster volunteers are on either side of a fence at this point. So, like in parts of Ulster, GAA activity really grinds to a halt. And again, it's because of this crossover of GAA and volunteer membership. So, like Derry, for example, like GAA activity in Derry almost stops completely by March 1915. It's similar in Tyrone. There's only one GAA club left properly active in Down by that stage. And, places like Wicklow and Kildare are experiencing similar difficulties. I mean, there's even an attempt in 1914, Ciaran, to affiliate rifle clubs to the GAA. Right? So can you imagine if that had happened? So as well as having hurling football clubs, rounders, the athletics is still going on, we now also have rifle clubs connected. Like, I mean, the mind boggles.
And we'll just pause there for a second, and I'm going to take a little break. And when we come back, we'll get into this in more detail.
Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
Welcome back. We were talking about the possibility of rifle clubs in the GAA. Mick, it would have brought a whole new meaning to sharpshooters. But
very nice.
How do things develop then as the volunteers grow? Because we've seen this mass demonstration of their scale in Dublin.
Oh, they're everywhere. And I mean, just on the rifle clubs, by the way, it was a very definite, beautiful piece of GAA politicking from Luke O'Toole. He said, if we had rifle clubs, that might actually interfere with how the volunteers run themselves. It could get very confusing. So let's not do that. And everybody went, oh, okay. All right, fair enough. So, like, the volunteers, in late 1913 are formed for a very specific purpose. When World War I breaks out, we have a split because you have John Redmond of the Constitutional Home Rulers, the Irish Party, saying, okay, if we want home rule, we need to show ourselves to be in this process. So volunteers go to war. You have the Sinn Féin faction going, oh, are you crazy? No way. Do not do that. And this obviously splits the volunteers. But in the GAA context, it doesn't really impact on the GAA in a way that you might expect when you have so much crossover. So it's not a huge issue. By and large, the GAA stays majority supportive of the constitutional movement, we'll call it, the Redmond faction, you have huge numbers of GAA members go to war. Really, really large numbers of GAA members go to war. But at the same time, as we move towards 1916, there is a recognising in newspapers like the Gaelic Athlete, which was the GAA's own publication, and in police reports as well, that there are close informal links between the GAA and the volunteers at a ground level. So from the Sinn Féin side of things, for example, Austin Stack is the one who's asked to organise the arms shipment from Germany that will come into Fenit that will power the rising itself. And he uses his GAA contacts on the ground, like GAA members, to try and get that to work. Now, as we know, of course, it all goes pear-shaped. Roger Casement ends up in Bannistrand, gets arrested, no guns land, etc., etc. So by the time we get to Easter 1916, I mean, as has been well recorded in history, the Rising was a complete surprise to everyone. It was, the GAA included. And again, we wonder how involved were the GAA? Well, if the GAA had known anything about the Rising happening but keep in mind it was to be on Easter Sunday 1916, they certainly would not have scheduled their GAA Congress for Easter Sunday 1916, which they did. And the matches that were played all over Dublin would surely have been cancelled as well. So the idea that the GAA, outside of having a good rump of Sinn Féin supporting volunteerists in their membership, that they had any more impact on the planning or the execution of the Rising is spurious, to say the least. They didn't have any. They were reacting. They reacted to whatever was going on.
And we should add that they would have been sensitive, because in a previous episode where we discussed the Offaly colours, we did illustrate that it was on foot of a GAA game in Tullamore that kind of the initial exchange of the 1916 uprising had developed. So they'd have been particularly sensitive in its aftermath to anything else that was going to occur.
Exactly. I mean, what we're talking about here, just in case people haven't heard that episode on the origin story of the Offaly jersey, Ciaran, am I right in saying there was an episode around St. Patrick's Day, wasn't it, in Tullamore, 1916?
That effectively was ignited at a GAA game in Tullamore and carried on in the days afterwards, and illustrated everything that you've just talked about, that there are home rulers involved, there are Sinn Féiners involved, there are loyalists whose families are affected by members of the families serving on the front in the First World War.
Yeah, so it was a lovely little microcosm of the situation, and you jump that on a month, and the Rising happens Easter Monday, and there are, as I say, just 305 GAA members plunged into combat. And, you don't want to say that was a small number either. I mean, it was a significant number, and it was particularly significant for those who fought and who were involved, and for their families, and for all the people ever since who would hold their participation in the Rising dearly. And that has to be recognised. Like O'Toole's GAA Club in Dublin, for example, 73 members of their club went out on Easter Monday, including Johnny MacDonald, the famous goalkeeper, the man in the cap. He was in the South Dublin Union. He was in Frongach afterwards. And, you go through some of the names. I mean, Dan McCarthy, a future GAA president, was also in the South Dublin Union. You had a man like Jim Maloney, who was imprisoned after the Rising, and he ended up forming Erin's Isle out in Finglas in 1917 and served as their secretary for 38 years. Eamon Bulfin, who hurled for UCD, was the man who unfurled the tricolour over the GPO. I've mentioned JJ Walsh already. Donlo Buchela was a Kildare footballer. Michael Collins himself, a secretary of a GAA club in London, Geraldines. Sean T. O'Kelly was involved in hurling and football back in the early part of the century. W.T. Cosgrave was chairman of Lord Edward's GAA at the time. They were all in the GPO. 4 signatories of the proclamation were GAA members. Tom Clark, Sean McDermott were in O'Toole's GAA club. Con Colmer, to name and Kent, also were GAA members. Patrick Pearce himself had been chairman of the Dublin Colleges Council in 1910 and was very big as a school. Obviously, he's a school teacher in St. Enda's and all the rest of it. you could see how he would be very keen to promote Gaelic football and hurling as Irish sports and so on. In fact, Pearse presented the O'Toole's Pipe Band, who were connected to the GAA club, with their banner. And they eventually became the Band of the Volunteers. Sean O'Casey, the playwright, was involved with them at the time. You had guys like Tomás Osh, who commanded the Volunteers at the Battle of Ashburn, which is one of the only theatres of combat outside of Dublin. He captained the Lisboa footballers down in West Kerry. He was one of the founders of Lusk GAA Club in County Dublin. On the Easter Sunday, the Volunteers in Wexford used football and hurling games in Wexford Park as cover for mobilising, and they got their cars in and they kind of all got together in the traffic and kind of got themselves sorted out. Sean Etchingham and Seamus Doyle were prominent GAA leaders in Wexford, also involved in the Volunteers. You jump across to Connacht. You had a blacksmith from Crockwell, Ciaran, called Tom Kenny, who, when he wasn't promoting hurling, was recruiting for the Volunteers. As a matter of fact, there was 6 members of Galway County Board, including our old friend, my new favourite administrator ever, Stephen Jordan from Athenry, who were volunteers at the time. Kenny was the chair of the Galway County Board.
Tom Kenny, of course, who Kenny Park is now named after.
There we go. Ulster, as we know, the rising didn't reach that far for all sorts of different reasons that we won't go into now. The one GAA member we know from Ulster that was resident in the province at the time that partook in the rising was a man called Patrick Rankin from Newry, Ciaran. And he cycled from Newry to Dublin and arrived on the Tuesday to take part in the rising. And he's the only Ulster GAA member that was resident in the province at the time that we know took part in the rising. I mean, there's one guy that I always like to mention. Whether it's Bloody Sunday or 1916, I always like to tell the story of Frank Burke because I think it's just such an incredible story. He was one of the last volunteers in the GPO at the very, very end. And if people remember the story of the very last moments of the fight, they went from the GPO across Henry Street into Henry Lane, which if you're walking up Henry Street, it's at the very top. It's a lane still there on the left-hand side, and there was a door in the GPO, and they just sprinted across. But that had become like Sniper's Alley. It was just getting peppered with machine gun fire because the British Army were watching guys coming out. So Burke was among those who braved the hail of machine gun fire to get across Henry Street into Henry Lane. He was there with Collins, Harry Boland. Of course, have I mentioned Harry Boland yet? Former Dublin player, Dublin County Board chairman, there in the GPO as well. They were all in Henry Lane with an order to charge the barricade at the end of the lane. That was going to be it. And Frank Burke's 21 at this stage. He's a student at St. Enda's, Pearse's school. He will succeed
Pearse as headmaster.
He certainly will. Spoiler alert, the ceasefire comes in. They hear about the ceasefire, so they don't have to charge the barricades. Thanks, Ciaran. You just ruined my dramatic arc there. But anyway, quite right. He does succeed Pearse in St. Enda's. He adored Pearse and he adored his teaching style and all the rest of it. But part of a company called Pearse's Own, he was presented with his gun as a volunteer by Pearse. As a matter of fact, he spent the 2 weeks before the rising in the school. They'd obviously dispense with the arts and crafts module on a Friday afternoon to finish up for the weekend, and they just spent the 2 weeks making grenades, filling cartridges with gunshot, fashioning batons on the
science class.
Science. If any RIC members called, yes, we're doing science. Yeah, that's all.
What's
we're doing.
That Bunsen burner for?
Don't mind that. Don't mind that. Frank Burke on a Holy Thursday went down, and this got me thinking. There must have been a rush at these kind of purchases that week. On Holy Thursday, he went downtown and bought a knapsack, 2 bandolier pouches, billy cans, and a pair of green puttees, to be properly kitted out for a rising. On Easter Saturday, he got confession and communion. And on the Easter Monday, he caught the tram, very civilised, from Rathfarnham into the city. And from there, he made his way to the GPO and kept watch from the roof of the GPO all week. Now, I remember his son, Ian, telling me that he ended up in the ground floor at the end, which is how he ended up getting to Henry Lane. But he was there. So he was among those who were arrested after. I mentioned Harry Boland there, James Nolan you mentioned. Other GAA people like Dan Fraher Field, Willie Walsh, Walsh Park, who said, Dick Fitzgerald, Paddy Cahill, who was a Kerry player, DP Walsh, who was a big GAA member, later on would become a very prominent IRA man in Tipperary. So all of these guys were arrested. The week after the rising, Luke O'Toole, the General Secretary, who we mentioned already, took his entire family out to Ballycumber in South Wicklow, where O'Toole was originally from. And his home place overlooked Ballinglen. It was up on a hill where he could see all the approach roads, and there was a stream running at the bottom of the hill. It was only passable in certain places, so very, very secure. So, everybody knew that even if the GAA hadn't been centrally involved in the organising of the rising, they were going to be targets in the aftermath.
And indeed, that is the case when you take examples like, as you say, James Nolan wouldn't have been actively involved in the rising. But because he held a prominent position within Sinn Féin and within the GAA, he would have been lifted. So they knew they were part of the nationalist culture, and that would have been the case in the aftermath of the rising.
Absolutely. And in practical terms, there is a huge impact. Games are disrupted post, right? There are no games allowed because we are living now in a period of martial law. So initially, there are no games at all allowed. That's relaxed, but there are still no inter-county games, I think, until late June 1916. Dublin just withdrew entirely from the football championship because you just couldn't field the team. They had so many guys interned. Kerry also withdrew, but that was more to do with not being able to finance their involvement. Train restrictions, a major, major problem getting people around. So All-Ireland football semi-final between Mayo and Cork is played in Athlone later in the year. And a huge crowd is expected, but then the trains are cancelled at the last minute. And that just, it's a terrible disappointment for both teams, but more so for the town of Athlone, who are expecting a tremendous influx of economic activity.
And indeed for the GAA, because without games, they have no finance to run the organisation.
Exactly. 6 counties in the Leinster Football Championship that year. Big drop. And as we've touched on before in a Christmas episode about Christmas All-Ireland finals and so on, the All-Ireland football final isn't played until the week before Christmas between Wexford and Mayo. Ciaran, I think that's the occasion when one of the Mayo players fell into the canal on the way.
The poor devil, yeah.
Poor fella pulled himself out and probably literally froze on the rest of the walk down to Croke Park.
Yeah, we should specify it wasn't that he was unsteady on his feet. He slipped on the ice that they were trying to crawl on to get to Croke Park.
But it just shows you the urgency to play games, because they had to get some kind of revenue in. And so it didn't matter how long it took, they just had to be played. But politically, this is really, really difficult for the GAA because, as we've said, individual members, yes, loads of them involved. As an organisation, no, not involved. In fact, trying to distance themselves from the whole thing if possible. So a Royal Commission is charged with finding the causes of insurrection. And one of their findings that they mention in their report is that the volunteers had effectively taken over the GAA. Sir Matthew Nathan is an Under-Secretary at Dublin Castle, and he says, quote, that the GAA had always been anti-British. They didn't allow uniformed police or soldiers at games. The Inspector General of the RIC says from 1908, an, quote, extreme section of the GAA endorsed the doctrine of Sinn Féin. The Director of Military Intelligence in Ireland says the volunteers had practically full control of the Gaelic League and the GAA. So they're being grouped in now effectively with any Irish nationalist movement as, if not organisers of a rising, well, definitely, how would you call it, instigators.
That is where we'll just take another short break. And when you come back, you can see what impact that type of tar on a particular brush has for the GAA.
Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
So welcome back, Mick. Just before the break, you were telling us that the authorities, the British authorities who've got a royal commission underway, believe that the GAA are absolutely central to what has occurred during the Easter Rising of 1916.
They certainly do. And the GAA's reaction is outrage, absolute outrage, because whether they sympathise with the principles driving the rising, the idea of Irish independence and so on, this is bad for business, man. This is really, really bad for business. Like, if we're going to be bunched with the volunteers, I mean, we may as well just fold up the whole thing, because they're not going to let us play any games. They're going to just harass us to within an inch of our lives. So the GAA put out an absolutely furious statement. They say the GAA are, quote, strictly non-political and non-sectarian association that barred political questions at any kind of its meetings. The statement had said it prohibited its councils, committees, clubs to take part in any political movement. Now, which is true. Like, no GAA club, no provincial council, no county committee is out there batting for the volunteers or saying, you know, let's all rise together. It's, as we've said, it's that fine line between institutional support and individual support.
No, they're talking about organising fixtures and where they'll be played and who referees them and how we grow the number of clubs. They're a sports governing body, but they are treading perilously close
exactly
to the line.
And that is even reflected in the statement. It goes on to admit, the GAA admit in the statement, that many members are involved in nationalist organisations, but they deny that the GAA was ever used in, quote, the furtherance of the objectives of the Irish volunteers. And on top of that, by the way, that police and uniformed soldiers are absolutely allowed into GAA matches, which is true. You're not allowed to play, though. That's a different thing, but we'll come on to that in a second. But we can see that there. We can see what's going on here. The rising has just occurred. People are in prison, being interned. Leaders are executed. And the GAA are making the political decision to distance themselves from this whole episode and the volunteers themselves. They have always, if you think back all the way to the first meeting in the Rotunda, they have always left themselves enough wriggle room just to keep that gap, that official gap between themselves and the volunteers. Even if their own newspaper and the police are reporting very close informal links between the volunteers and the GAA, officially, publicly, we are two completely separate organisations, and whatever our members are doing on their spare time when they're hurling and footballing, sure, what's that to do with us, really?
What happens next? They've got a red flag above them. What actions are taken against them?
So there's harassment. As I mentioned, their games are stopped. There are none, but they eventually get up and running by July, August. What's really concerning, there are two things that are really concerning the GAA Central Council now. One of them is this issue about trains and just getting people to matches. The other thing is about an entertainment tax that's come down. Now, we spoke about this in our episode on Gaelic Sunday recently, and I just want to touch on it very briefly again. So this entertainment tax essentially was a tax on entertainments. If you were running a sport or any kind of entertainments whatsoever, you had to pay a little tax.
Or a foreign dance.
A foreign dance, lads. Yeah. We're not quite, what are we, jitterbugging by now? No, I love that thing. No, whatever they were doing, flapping about the place. Yeah, anything like that, you owe us a few bob. The GAA were hoping to get an exemption on that as a cultural organisation. And an Irish MP had given them hope that may be possible. They went so far, and this again tells you how committed the GAA were to just getting through this period. They went and met with John Maxwell, who was the head of the military in Ireland, the British military, the man who had overseen the execution of the leaders, the arrests and the internments of people. They had no problem sitting down with him and talking about this entertainment tax and what can we do to possibly exclude the GAA from this. So that conversation was ongoing. They were eventually told, if you want to be out of that, you need to ditch your bans on rugby players, soccer players, hockey players, and anyone who takes an oath of allegiance to the crown. Ditch those rules. And then we can look at you as a sporting organisation. But that rule makes you a political organisation. So that was never going to fly with the GAA at that point. And the Fermanagh Times actually expressed the view quite succinctly. It said, if the Sinn Féiners want their hurling to be free of taxes, they can go into the trenches and hurl bombs. So there was that attitude as well.
Could have been an effective means of defence at the time.
Might have worked. But like get a couple of long-hitting 65 experts.
Give it to the keepers.
Might have worked. Never thought of that. But they ended up just refusing to pay that tax. And His Majesty's revenue did pursue them for a bit, but eventually the money we were talking about was so small, the sums we were talking about were so small, they kind of quit on them in 1917 and went, if they don't want to pay the tax, just whatever, we've got bigger fish to fry here. The issue around the trains was an ongoing one for forever, that they just had to continually debate with the local with the authorities to try and get trains so they could get people to matches. But in the same way, and again, this is reflective of the GAA's history all the way through, they hold up a mirror to Irish life in all ways. By July 1916, the Tipperary hurlers, when championship hurling has resumed, they wear rosettes in tribute to the executed leaders of 1916. So a couple of months after, and we remember that the reaction to the Rising, when it occurred, was largely negative. The execution of the leaders changes public opinion. Now this is being reflected by the Tipperary hurlers. By November 1916, the GAA attend a meeting about running a tournament in aid of the Volunteer Dependence Fund, and hurling matches are played to help support those volunteers and their families.
Indeed, coming back to the Offaly story again, it is the use of the field in Tullamore for said purpose that proves divisive within the local GAA community.
So that debate continues and continues. But what we are seeing is that the GAA, from pre-1916, who were largely, comfortable with the Irish party, the constitutional approach, the John Redmond approach, they're now shifting with the rest of the country towards more radical elements, shall we call them at the time, Sinn Féin, a more aggressive approach to Home Rule. They also get involved in the Political Prisoners Amnesty Association, which is in itself a major boost to Sinn Féin to have the GAA behind that. By Christmas 1916, as no doubt you'll talk about when we talk about Frongach in our members episode, by Christmas 16, players are coming home, including my old friend Frank Burke. He sends a postcard from Frongach Post Office on December 23rd. He says, "First taste of freedom, writing from Frongach Post Office. Hope you're well. It's Misha de Vock Fergus." So he's back in Dublin by Christmas Eve. He gets a tram to see his sister in Drumcondra. He had last seen her when she was acting as a nurse in the GPO. Her name was Aoife, and he actually meets her on the tram that he's taking to Drumcondra to find her. He gets the train home to Enfield. Frank Burke was originally from Carbery in County Kildare. He gets the train home to Enfield that afternoon. His brother Jack is waiting for him with a horse and trap, but the train is so late, Jack is inside waiting for him. The horse and trap heads away home. So when the lads come out, when Frank eventually arrives with no horse and trap, so they have to organise a car. And it's one of those images that I always find kind of moving or poignant from that period, that they're going home and of course it's dark, and the only thing that's lighting their way along the roads of Kildare are the Christmas candles that are burning in the houses. And in the same way, when they get to their own home house and the family is waiting for Frank, the Christmas candles are burning there in the windows, waiting for him to welcome him home. Now, he will end up winning 5 All-Ireland medals with Dublin, Ciaran, between 1917 and 1923, including an All-Ireland hurling medal in 1917. So, and actually, if you talk about 300 odd GA members out of 1,800, if you look at that Dublin hurling team in 1917, 3 of them were involved. So Sean Hyde, he would actually later become an intelligence officer for Michael Collins. Sean O'Donovan was involved in the Rising, and Burke. So, it almost reflects the same kind of quota or ratio. But as I say, the GAA are moving in a totally different direction. By 1917, Croke Park is allowed to be used for a volunteer meeting. There's over 900 people in the grandstand, and De Valera, Michael Collins, Terence McSweeney, they're all there on a platform made of hay bales speaking to the crowd. During the 1917 football championship, Clare lined up behind a banner that said "Up De Valera." Like in 1914, Ciaran, they had paraded behind a banner proclaiming Willie Redmond, an Irish Party MP. So that's the most glaring example of the shift from right to left, if you like. Harry Boland, who I've mentioned already a few times now, carried the volunteer flag in front of the parade before the 1917 All-Ireland football final between Wexford and Clare. Early 1918, the Leinster Council secretary position is up for grabs. Jack Shouldice wins that in a landslide. He has been in turn very active volunteer. 1918, the GAA joined a broad alliance of nationalist organisations. You can see where this is going. They extend that ban on the oath of allegiance to anyone, like civil servants. Everybody now is brought in underneath this. 1918, we've spoken about Gaelic Sunday already. Mass resistance to the imposing of a permit law that would have forced every single GAA game to have a permit. People can go back and listen to that episode about that. So by 1919, when the first Dáil is sitting and the War of Independence is raging, like that first Dáil is debating whether the GAA should remove that oath of allegiance ban. GAA Congress has the same debate in 1919, and Harry Boland gives one of the most maybe famous speeches of Congress history, and one of the most impactful speeches in terms of keeping that ban in place for a long, long time, when he says that the GAA owed its position to the fact that it had always drawn the line between the garrison and the Gael. So in that statement alone, the GAA's position now is very, very, very clear.
And the country has changed more in 2 years than probably it had in the 30 prior to the Rising.
Absolutely. Now, we won't even dwell on Bloody Sunday at this point because it's just too big a story to go into. But Bloody Sunday occurs in November 1920. That radicalises everything even further. But what's interesting, Ciaran, in the next stage, and we've already seen how the GAA individually were not peripheral to the Rising. When you talk about those 300 odd volunteers who turned out, but as an organisation, we're very peripheral to it and keen to create distance. By 1922, different story. So JJ Walsh, who I mentioned before, is now inside in the Dáil, saying the GAA had been the principal contributors in the fight against England. I think you will agree with that. It's beginning the retelling of the narrative around where the GAA were through this revolutionary struggle, and we will see it in all sorts of ways. We will see it at the naming of the Hogan stand in the speech given by the GAA president, placing very much, the GAA at the centre of the revolutionary struggle. We will see it in another decade on when Hill 60, which was originally named after a hill that was fought over in Gallipoli during World War I, being renamed Hill 16, and warnings being given to the press to refer to it from now on as Hill 16. It's no longer Hill 60. The myths about the rubble from the GPO and the Rising being used to build
the O'Reilly's car.
The O'Reilly's car. There's another man for whom GAA clubs have been named after. Kearns O'Reilly's, for example, in Tralee. Yeah, his car being part of the rubble that built Hill 16. I mean,
again, another episode that you can find in the vast catalogue of Corge exclusives.
So this goes on and on and on and becomes calcified into a version of GAA history that fits what they need, which is what they need in the early 1920s, heading into the 30s and on, is to be the primary sporting organisation in the country. And, they play that card a lot. When the British wanted to make a point, they didn't go to Lansdowne Road, or to disrupt a soccer match or a rugby game. They came to Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, and they shot one of our players and 13 others. The blood of the martyrs is soaked into this soil. And over time, the GAA becomes part of those pillars of 20th century life in Ireland, the church, Fianna Fáil, the GAA. a huge part of that is retelling their role in the revolutionary struggle as an organisation. You come as far as the 50th anniversary in 1966. Croke Park is central. There are two major shows there. The first one is called Shocked or Far, Shocked Law. It's written by Brian McMahon. It's a 90-minute night show that runs for 3 days across March 1966 and eventually goes up to Casement Park, as a matter of fact, and plays there for a bit. The next one is the big one, the big national commemoration. It's called Áisirí Glór na Cásca, Resurrection, the Easter Project. So in Croke Park, you have 3 stages facing the Cusack stand. There are 16 portraits of the rising leaders hanging from the roof of the Hogan stand. It's produced by Tomás McDonagh and it's performed over 5 days that April. Alf Murray, on the eve of the Shocked or Far, Shocked Law show, which was a GAA sanctioned event, the Áisirí Glór na Cásca was actually that show was like 800 plus people. It details the political struggle from 1798 to 1919. It was massive. But Alf Murray, on the eve of the GAA one, Shocked or Far, Shocked Law, he said the GAA regards its national attitude as an essential part of the obligation that history and traditions imposed upon if we are to strengthen the national character and provide at least a part of the spiritual background that ensures the continuance of the struggle for the national soul. So he's again reiterating the fact as he sees it, or the fact that the GAA would like to see it, that the quest for national unity now, for a 32 county Ireland, that the GAA are at the spiritual heart of that struggle. So 50 years on, they are positioning themselves in a very, very different place. Now, by the way, I have to say, one really nice thing they did was for any rising veteran, Ciaran, they got a free ticket to the 1966 All-Ireland hurling final.
I was about to say, the scramble of hands in the air that must have been saying they were in the GAA or in the GPO.
Well, I'm just glad they got something out of it, you know. Well, I mean, you know, it's a reflection again then of the work that has occurred, particularly in the last, I suppose, 20 years around the GAA and its involvement in the Rising. That when we come to the centenary of the Rising in 2016, that the GAA's commemoration is a very different beast from what we see in 1966. It shouldn't be a surprise. 50 years is a long time. But at the same time, it was good to see a lot more, I suppose, nuance. It was a lot more of a rounded attempt to contextualise the GAA's role in the Rising. Like, people might remember the National Football League final that year between Dublin and Kerry. There was a kind of an interpretive song and dance, sort of a spectacle after that game, which was the GAA's kind of commemoration, the centenary commemoration. Now, there was plenty of guns and bandoliers and the promo stuff, and it was all there. I mean, they didn't kind of welch on any of that stuff. They know their audience, like. But at the same time, there was a lot of nuance surrounding it. So, for example, the GAA president at the time was Aegon O'Farrell, and he wrote in the programme that day for the Football League final, he mentioned the fact that a huge number of GAA members were fighting in World War I at the same time that the Easter Rising was occurring. So those people had been written out completely of the story for a long, long time. But now they are being returned to the story as GAA members. And the story of the GAA members, and I don't think that the sort of the telling of the story of the Easter Rising and the GAA members in a more real way diminishes in any way the contribution and the involvement of GAA members in it. As a matter of fact, if anything, it enriches it, because we now have a vision of Frank Burke as a 21-year-old crouching in Henry Lane, surrounded by these revolutionary leaders, ready to give his life at the age of 21 for something he believed in, saved at the last second, who goes on to have this extraordinary career within the GAA, survives Bloody Sunday, marking Michael Hogan. We know so much more about him than we ever would have if we hadn't gone down this road, you know, and to find out just more about what motivated these people in this period of time, and not just the plain, rather dull version that I would have been brought up with, certainly, that, you know, the 1916 Rising and the GAA kind of went hand in hand. When as a matter of fact, it didn't. It was very nuanced. It was very, very polarized in some ways. The decisions that were made by individuals on their own. The impact on the GAA itself was enormous. And all these things need to be laid out and examined and assessed and understood for what they were. And I think it makes for a hell of a lot more of a colourful organisation than the kind of cut and dried version that we were sold for so many years.
And that was probably true of the approach that many bodies had to the two different commemorations. So if we think of the 50th anniversary on the national broadcaster, in the national newspapers, in our local newspapers, and compare how that was covered in the centenary, so much more had come to light, so much more study had been done. It's a fascinating story. I wouldn't quite describe it as a myth buster. I don't think it's a myth. 300 from 1800 is a fairly significant contribution by any standards. So thanks for that, Mick. And if you want to find out what happened to a lot of them, then you could join the Cordial Club, because we are going to be discussing the subject of where is the other Croke Park. And spoiler alert, it's in Frongach in Wales. So consider giving us that £5 a month and you can have that one, along with many other exclusives that we've probably referenced now, several in this episode alone. Hill 60, Hill 16, all of those stories, it's all intertwined. But again, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope you had a great Easter. It's goodbye from me.
Agus Slán.
Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordial Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.